that that kid that was, the indigenous kid in Australia that was supposedly suicidal, and
Oh,
his name was Quaden.
but it turns out he's an adult,
No, he's
right?
not.
Oh, he's not. Or that's
But this is the problem. Is like
that's the thing
that's
that's
the
being spread around,
conspiracy.
right?
Yeah, you have
Yeah.
a bunch of people who are trying to be internet sleuths and trying to figure out the hidden agenda,
And because there's a young man who is like almost in his 20s, I believe, who looks very similar to this
right.
child.
Well, any person has dwarfism looks like similar. Like everybody has to acknowledge that. It's like
Yeah.
there are certain traits. It's the same shit if you have Down syndrome. There's
Yeah.
certain traits that are inherited with the syndrome. So that's
Yeah.
where it's like, of course he fucking looks like the older dwarf, because all dwarfs look alike because of the certain
To a certain degree.
to a certain degree. It's not that they all look exactly alike.
Yeah.
They all have similar characteristics because it shortens your arms, it makes your
Oh,
head bigger.
man.
There's certain things that it makes happen to your body. And then the people that are not aware of the biology
Oh, wow.
then become internet sleuths
Yeah,
to try to figure out, oh, this guy looks like this other dwarf, this guy with dwarfism.
So this is like a compound sensitivity issue. Some people are going to recognize this, and some people aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are going to capitalize on the ability of the people who aren't able to recognize the signs of dwarfism.
Right.
I think that, I know somebody, and she told me that her husband has this distinct inability to remember faces.
Mm-hmm.
And it presents a pretty serious hurdle, I would assume, because if you can't remember faces, if you have no real facial recognition, it would make it really difficult to forge relationships. It would mean that almost everything has to be written down at that level.
You're going to seem like an asshole to people, too.
Oh, yeah.
Because
So
you're never going to recognize them.
yeah. And so then, to continue with that, if you're unable to recognize the difference in facial features and identify and to distinguish people from one another, of course somebody's not going to be able to distinguish one dwarf from another.
Of course not, yeah.
Oh, that's just terrible.
Yeah, I mean, but then it's like, but the issue is they have all of these people who are trying to say that it's this older dude who didn't see. There was a report about the kid from 3 or 4 years ago that was talking about him being bullied then.
Yeah.
That was like, no, he's 6 then, and he's 9 now. So there's
3
there's
years of
visible proof
Yeah.
of him being recorded with his age publicly to say this kid specifically is not this adult dwarf.
Oh, wow.
So, and then the problem is what ends up happening. I think we talked about this with Greta.
The democratization of the internet and this kind of technology is proving to be a very horrible tool,
dangerous.
a dangerous
Super
tool in the wrong
dangerous.
hands.
Because the kid's also an actor, so then it's as if actors can't be suicidal. That's what the conclusion is that he's acting and making the whole thing up.
But haven't we gone through like the last 10 years of watching our favorite comedians one
Of
by
course.
one checking out,
Yeah.
and then everyone experiencing social pain and
Exceptional radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional radio.
The other day you were talking about how when did organisms first develop the ability to fart? It's been in the back of my mind for the past week, because I thought, well, I mean, as you suggested, at some point some animal ate something that disagreed with their system, and then they produced some gas. How did they get it out? Did they just explode? And I started thinking about that. I was like, well, a slug is an example of a creature that still only has one orifice.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what happens when they get gas.
Yeah, a lot of cephalopods are one way.
Yeah. What comes in goes out.
Yeah, or I guess it's a two-way, one entrance. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a omnidirectional port.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about this, and it's like, these are creatures that are still around. I'm sure they eat things at some period that cause them to expand. Like,
maybe.
Do they? I mean,
but that's part of it in that.
But wouldn't a concentration of some kind of gas like that maybe like kill them? I don't know.
But that's where maybe their mouths aren't capable of eating the things that would cause, or their orifice or whatever. Because that's where, when you have these whales that only eat kelp or, you know, whatever their mechanisms are that allow them to to eat kelp but not eat fish. It's you know, I'm thinking if they had fish in their gut, they might have problems, but then there's something keeping them from getting the fish in the gut, and that's kind of where there was probably a wave of them that didn't have that mechanism.
Yeah.
They all died off, but there's all these elements of, you know, we've been here for so long, but our lifespan is so short, and we don't have the capacity to think outside of it. That, you know, in a way, evolution is just iteration. I mean, obviously, it's just iteration and recombination based on the best outcomes and the worst outcomes. But when you have that happen over billions of years, it's really hard to actually fathom what that means. And that means there might have been 100,000 years when animals were eating things and it was making them spontaneously combust because they couldn't fart yet.
Or they would like just rupture and then fall over and die.
Right. Yeah. You know, it may not have been that extreme, but knowing that it happens to fucking pigeons and birds that eat rice or popcorn or whatever, or the kernels.
Bread.
Yeah, bread even.
Bread.
It can expand to the point and cause their stomachs to burst.
Speaking of animals eating bread, there was I think it was in Florida. I kind of have a thing for news in Florida because it just seems so outlandish that all those things happen in one state. But there's a nature park, and there were pictures of bread off of the trail. They had like a path to walk through the park, and there were pictures of bread on it, and little notes next to it said, "Please do not feed the animals bread." And there were like crocodiles or alligators in this one area, and they said that what ends up happening is these animals will eat the bread and they can't digest it. It just sits there and rots in their stomach, and they get gas and they get really sick, and then they don't move.
And then they get easy prey.
It's just a bad deal. And so it's the same effect with other lizards, I believe, in that they're not supposed to eat this stuff.
Yeah.
But they will, because they're.
But it's perfectly okay for human guts.
I mean, is it?
Of course not. I mean, but that's why we have all these Crohn's disease.
My understanding is that we've added chromosomes to wheat.
Yeah.
To make it hardier so it can withstand the environment that has been changing over the last several hundred years.
Yeah.
And not just that, but to be able to grow it in environments that it normally wouldn't have grown. We've turned it into an invasive species.
Right. Which also makes it harder for us to digest.
Yeah.
So that's one of the problems with presenting wheat in this form. It's not the same wheat as the settlers were eating. And there's a whole, again, genetically modified foods are not, it's not black and white, because there's a whole lot of things about modifying genetics that, you know, I think the best example is always strawberries and bananas, where the original are basically inedible for humans, or there's nothing really worth it for humans eating until we modify the organism. And I think there's,
well, tomatoes are related to deadly nightshade.
I mean, yeah, you know, there's a whole lot of things that would not be good for humans if we didn't find the genetic variation that worked with our gut and our biome. And that's kind of where
we lucked out with rice.
I mean, did we though?
Yeah.
And it seems like there was a lot of, you know, there was already thousands of years of
cultivation.
Yeah.
No,
So
I mean,
I
think we lucked out with rice in the sense that it grows pretty much anywhere. It's like a weed as long as we can provide it standing water for the first period of time.
And this is one of the things I think with the false premises about life in the universe.
Also,
so it's
I
like,
understand that rice has been heavily genetically modified, especially in Southeast Asia, where they use it to deliver a vaccine for like norovirus or one of those really nasty, gives you diarrhea till you die kind of things.
I think what has happened is our science fiction has misinformed us into thinking that because of the harsh aspect of space, a planet that is lush with life, we're presented as if it's going to pose threats to us, when in fact a planet that is lush with life presents constant options for food for the life forms on that planet, because everything is sustenance for something else ultimately.
Yeah.
So I think that's where, if it wasn't rice, it would have been widget X or whatever that nature produced.
It would have been glorp.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it.
It would have been
that we don't have
white, off-white glorp. There we go.
But if we're eating glorp on planet Jovante, and it's assumed by us that the glorp is the only thing that planet could produce, that's a false premise, because it's just a matter of any planet that's going to have abundance of life is going to have that glorp in some form.
Yeah.
Whether it's rice or wheat or...
Well, you know, my understanding is that corn is also is like wheat. It's a grass. So if we take wheat all the way back, we can't even eat it either.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's one that I'm really profoundly impressed by. It's the califerous foods branch. It's cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and mustard. I think mustard is the originator of all that stuff. But we get, mustard, cauliflower, broccoli, I think. We get a lot of really interesting vegetables from one family. And, of course, the cabbage.
Mm-hmm.
It's just all sorts of nutrients that are good. I think every culture has a cabbage dish or some kind of, like, califerous vegetable dish. I know the Chinese utilize every single one of them.
Yeah. Well, and then because of their nutrient content, it ends up being it's part of a dish that can work on its own, but it works as a side, and so you see the
potential for it.
Yeah, I mean, well, in the sense of in meals, it's hard for white rice to be the entree because of the lack of nutrition content
and the neutral flavor too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's going to deliver. It's a sauce delivery mechanism.
Yeah.
Well, unless you just eat it with butter and sugar, or not sugar, salt. I mean, sugar works too.
You can do salt and sugar. You can do all that stuff.
And you're just in that mood. But even then, it's not an entree. It's like it's eating popcorn or something.
Yeah.
Nobody eats popcorn for dinner. That's just something people don't do.
I mean, I think college students do.
I don't think they do. I think college students might eat nachos for dinner, but popcorn, that's one of those things. It's just not filling enough. So you might end up eating
you'd have to eat an entire bag of them.
No, that's where people end up eating an entire tub of the fucking cheddar, caramel, and the fucking butter, because it's so not filling that you end up eating the fucking entire holiday tub.
Oh, God.
And then having that crazy stomach ache and wondering why you're still kind of hungry. But that's, calories are not just calories.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier and easier to prove it, but it's harder for people who were born before a certain date to accept
well,
that.
I think that, the calorie is the calorie. It's just a matter of how much you have to get through to get to that calorie.
Right. I mean,
some because there's a term that I've become more acquainted with called bioavailability, and not all nutrients have the same measurable bioavailability as others. Not all enzymes have the same kind of bioavailability, meaning that your body has to do extra steps to get to those nutrients or those enzymes or just the raw chemicals themselves. And I found this really, really intriguing because it's like It reminded me of the pistachio. You know, it's a delicious nut, but you got to work a little bit to get to it. And there's another one like that.
Same with avocado.
Yeah, avocado.
And I think that's, there's all these foods that you do have to work a little harder to get. And in the process, it doesn't necessarily it doesn't force you to eat slower. You have no choice but to eat slower.
Or more deliberately.
And in that it's a lot more difficult to binge on them, but you also absorb the nutrients slower.
Speaking of avocados, I also learned that if you take the seed and you scrape off that tough brown exterior, it reveals this really, apparently, an extra delicious nut that's like loaded in antioxidants. Like one of the best raw sources of antioxidants imaginable.
But you have to work hard.
But you gotta get through that really tough shell, and you aren't just gonna be able to take a knife to it, or you might take a cheese grater type, a grating instrument, and shave it off over a period of time. So you gotta work for it.
Yeah, same with like coconut. You know? I think that's where again, you have all these extremely nutritious and delicious foods that they're not easily. The bioavailability is not easy. Like
coffee,
they're not accessible. Yeah.
And we gotta roast it. Well, you don't have to. You can do that white bean, the unroasted bean. But you gotta roast it, grind it up, soak it in liquids for some period of time, hot or cold. The hotter, the faster it returns the goods, but you get more of that acrid, bitter flavor. And then you still have to serve it up. You still have to add something to serve it up.
Yeah.
I think the culture of adding all these things to coffee is really interesting. Like there are times when I've had these candy drinks, and they're basically a soda to me. I mean, it's as much of a soft drink as a Coke is.
It's very American though.
But it doesn't have the carbonation. Yeah, no, I don't.
Like you go to any place besides America, basically, and you're getting almost
the opposite.
Shit. Like and then a lot of cases it'll be espresso, and not.
I think any place within earshot of Turkey is going to have that kind of tradition of a really, strong brew and hot.
Well, coffees. And if it's Turkey, they're going to use Nescafe. So even then, it's not going to be the same type of brew as in America.
Yeah.
It's like really difficult to find anything but Nescafe in Turkey.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually kind of
extremely difficult.
So that's that in itself.
I mean, but if it's not Nescafe, then it's like the Turkish mud coffee.
That's what I mean. The stuff that they brew in those crazy, like those super. It's like a espresso machine, but it's like a super.
There's not really a Starbucks culture there. There's Starbucks there, but that culture, because the coffee culture predates it, and it's so different. Starbucks just isn't that. It's not that big there.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. Like years ago, I worked as a barista at a place called Encore Cafe, and I made coffee of all sorts of different styles. And I remember at the time it was just like cappuccino, espresso, latte, mocha. But then they wanted to add like cafe americano and cafe. There was another one, and then next thing I know, it was like the coffee explosion happened, and all these different additives emerge, and you can add this, or you can do this, or you can, if you do the milk in this fashion, it turns out like this. And this was before the foam art started happening, and that stuff's crazy. Some of it's really cool.
Yeah. Well, I was working at Starbucks at the time, and what happened was they started doing the Frappuccino, and the Frappuccino, it forced other companies to start expanding their menus and start trying other things. Yeah. So then it made the coffee culture become more ubiquitous with all these different types of drinks that are then, you go to a regular non-chain coffee shop, and they're going to have probably 10 different types of drinks at least, because Starbucks basically forced them to. And the problem with that was because Starbucks started putting they would literally put Starbucks on opposite corners and end up having completely different
clientele.
Clients. it didn't even seem possible. But working there, you would see the ones that were going across the street was a completely different like they didn't even go like because they were regulars. They wouldn't even cross the street to go to a different Starbucks.
Yeah, I mean, to be
And
honest, I didn't know what Starbucks was for a long time because I'd always gone to one of the local coffee shops. There's a place called Runcible Spoon that does well, I'm pretty sure it's the same machine and they're using the same process, but at some point things changed. And so,
well, they only had, I think, one in Bloomington for a long time, but in Indianapolis, like the first Starbucks I worked at was in 81st and Ditch in Indianapolis, and they had another one literally down the street.
Interesting.
But this is, 2000, like 99,
Well,
2000.
yeah, like
they already had, this was like peak Starbucks.
Downtown Bloomington, there were like 3 coffee shops all within like, yelling distance of each other practically. And then every sandwich shop had coffee too because they're going to compete on coffee. And I remember that, like, the thing that led me to trying Starbucks wasn't really any kind of active marketing that I noticed. It was I was walking past the place with somebody after a class, and when I recognized a friend of mine inside, actually I think it was you.
That's probably true. Yeah.
I think that's the reason that I
worked
went in there.
for a while.
The one on Indiana. Yeah, I think I walked in there because you were there. I think that's the reason. Like, I'm sure that I
probably gave you a free drink or some shit.
Maybe.
I mean, there's no way I made you pay for it.
I don't. No, that's like I don't even remember ordering coffee. That's the thing. But I remember like, it didn't even seem like a coffee shop to me. It seemed like a very different thing. And this was, I gotta try and explain this. They opened a Starbucks up in a historic building.
Oh yeah,
like downtown Bloomington on Indiana, right across the street from the school.
The Hoagie Carmichael building.
And so this building was already like, you can just look at it and know that it's got some stories. It's a cool building. It's got a unique look to it. It looks like it belongs in a big city. Mm-hmm. And the way that it was, the way they did the interior design, they didn't hide any of that. They didn't try to make it look like anything new. No. They just kind of shoved a bunch of stuff in there. So it was really cool. Every other Starbucks I've been in has essentially been like built to order, like a McDonald's.
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about, they're actually really good if a building has some historic context to it. They'll keep that intact, but they'll keep the Starbucks aesthetic when they design it.
Yeah.
But if there's like open steel piping or some shit that's left over,
they'll leave it out.
They'll leave it out. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that about companies that are willing to work around an existing structure and capitalize on those kinds of traits, because those are the things that give a building character. And those are the things I think that make it feel like more than just a coffee shop or more than just a insert small business here.
Yeah. Well, there's just not that many old buildings in America, period, though.
That's true.
I think the oldest stuff is on the East Coast, and that goes back to like the 1600s in some cases. But, I mean, if we're talking about Western, obviously there's the indigenous stuff.
Yeah, like all those giant mounds they've been discovering because they could finally scan things from up high and get good resolution.
Yeah, I mean, but even like the Aztec pueblos and shit like that. There's there's old history in America that's not European.
That's right. So years ago, I went out to a place called Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and part of that was reading all the history of the Southwest. And I remember reading about how there were structures that were just way too big to have just been, out in the middle of nowhere where there's no water either, but giant structures that, I mean, obviously there was water there at some point, but giant structures that were very clearly intended for large-scale commerce. Because there wouldn't have been a reason to have a building that size unless you were trying to bring in crops to distribute or to conduct trade. And the way that it was constructed, it was like, how some modern airports the way they're designed, you kind of go in, and then it's kind of a circle or a half circle that kind of fans out to all the terminals.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like that, except, actually I think it might have been airport terminal sized structure even.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember thinking, it's like this thing, it's backs up against a wall and just opens up to, the desert. And that desert couldn't have been a desert the entire time.
No, of course not.
And so,
Oh, yeah.
so during some period of time, the indigenous populations of this continent were building city-sized structures.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they teach this stuff in school?
Well,
why do I have to wait 20 years to?
The problem is
to watch a Discovery
that stuff
Channel?
gets compartmentalized to then Ancient Aliens, because there is a level of they have to go through the iterations of understanding the proper context as determined by the West for these quote unquote discoveries, because they destroyed the historical context in the first place, and in many cases.
Yeah.
So what you have is the colonial restructuring and retelling of histories. You have examples like Egyptology, for example. What ends up happening is the colonialist then becomes the authority on the issue.
They get to decide what
So
becomes
then,
history.
You'll have all these people coming out of Harvard or Princeton with degrees in Native American architecture history, and they're going to be the ones that are then telling the stories. But then after that, it takes even longer for that information to disseminate into the high school and middle school curricula. So it's like these information hierarchies are in place to control the diffusion and dissemination of information in a way that allows for a patriarchal and colonialist authority over what gets taught. And this is how you end up with slavery not getting taught correctly, indigenous history and arts not getting taught correctly, fucking early 1900s post slavery industrialism not getting taught correctly. Because what the big issue with that is, they don't teach it correctly, because that's when you have the unions forming, and you have a very strong anti-union sentiment in this country that is a byproduct of the misinformation campaigns originating all the way back to those times. So it's like, in the same way that we're still not even out from under the thumb of the influence of reefer madness in that same period, we haven't come out of the influence of the anti-union sentiment of that same exact period.
So on specifically to that, because what you just kind of spoke to me, we're still reeling from the effects of the British Empire. And I want to be really clear about this. Last year, I think it was June, British Steel declared that they were bankrupt and they had to liquidate.
Mm-hmm.
So the industrial backbone of Great Britain went belly up, meaning they can't possibly sustain a fully industrialized status for much longer. They're not producing their own steel. They have to buy steel from somebody else, which means that their manufacturing is probably going to move offshore if it hasn't already.
Right.
Or it's going to start moving offshore. We're witness to essentially the death rattle of the British Empire.
I mean, but it only took fucking 600 years.
It only took 600 years. So that's like 600 years where British agents of the British Empire just delivered like the worst kind of they destroyed history, they destroyed culture.
Yep.
They injected drugs into China because the Chinese didn't want to let
fucking opium wars.
Yeah, because the Chinese didn't
Shout
want them
out
to
to my
walk
middle
around.
school teachers for fucking teaching us about the opium wars, because I know a lot of people didn't learn about that shit.
Yeah, I think that I learned about the opium wars as a child because I asked a question and my mom decided to explain to me that why there was tension and why Hong Kong wasn't actually part of China.
And then
But
to
yeah,
to
there's
learn.
like
But
600
then
years.
I was gonna say to
600
learn about the
years.
opium wars when we were kids, and then see that shit happen in America.
Ugh, this is the American
from our
edition.
own from our own industry, turning that shit on our. It's like this. Okay, I was trying to struggle
So-
to what to call it. We can call it cannibal capitalism because capitalism eats its own at this point. This is so far beyond crony capitalism.
Yeah.
We're at cannibal capitalism. It eats people. It does not care.
So what's the Lucky's? That Denver or Colorado based organic food store, right? They were trying to compete with Fresh Thyme and Whole Foods nationally, and part of it was they got backing from Kroger, I believe. And lo and behold, Kroger is expanding their organics offerings and pulling out of their deal with Lucky's. So I think that's a perfect example of cannibal capitalism.
Yeah.
They bought in to get the development.
Yep.
They let the team who was doing the development
That happens in
succeed.
every fucking industry,
And
man.
then once they got their data, they said, thanks, we'll see ya. And because Lucky's can't actually sustain that kind of growth on their own.
So what you're talking about is the classic problem with being a startup in any industry, because you get a big company come in and pretend to be your friend, pretend to be the wind beneath your wings, and then they fucking take that shit right the fuck out beneath your wings, and then you fall right down, and they act like you were never there. And they act like you made all this shit up, and they destroy your character, and they destroy the connection to your history, and it makes it seem like that company never happened. I can guarantee you, look at any industry, there's like 1,000 fucking companies like that for every big company you know that got swallowed up and spat out by cannibal capitalism in a way that now we just accept it as
Capitalism.
yeah, and I think
It's American capitalism.
it wasn't always that way.
I've seen a lot of, so good old Bernie is doing real well in all of the primaries and caucuses and all that stuff. And so there's a lot of clamor about, he's going to get the nomination this time unless the DNC pulls some shit. But I've been reading that there are still a lot of people who associate his policies with socialism because he, decided to tack the word socialism onto his policies instead of regulated capitalism or some regulated economy.
Right.
He could have come up with a better name, but so people want to anchor on to the socialism, and then when you look at his policies, it's really a lot more like the regulatory policies that Scandinavian countries have. And then when these people are reminded of this, they say, well, they're super free market. They're super capitalist.
Right.
They're like more capitalist than we are.
Yeah.
They're just heavily regulated, and they're like, so that's what we want. We just want the regulations. And then of course but he's a socialist, and they can't get around that. People don't want to get around that because of the word association.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes this issue of semantics.
Right.
But nobody wants to actually engage in semantics because they don't want to define the words.
And they don't want to do any research or homework to learn what these words actually mean either.
Or the processes that they outline.
Right.
So
because in this context, socialism does not imply that there is no free market.
Yeah.
There is only
regulation.
Well, it's not even socialism doesn't even imply regulation of the market.
His policy does.
Socialism implies that there is ownership of a form of production of some sort. Communism is the complete ownership of all means of production. And even then, the countries we call communist aren't fucking communist. So China doesn't own all the means of production. They allow the private market to exist, but the private market has a certain onus to the state, which is effectively taxes. I mean, when you break it down.
I think what happened with China, it seems, is that they observed what goes on in America, and they realized that the business owner or the proprietor of a business is incentivized to invest in their business and to put out a better product. And so by by relaxing their stranglehold on the entire production cycle and allowing more autonomy within the small business sector and the
Ironically.
industrial sector. Yeah, ironically, like all of a sudden, China experiences the kind of growth that we haven't had in a generation.
So how are they simultaneously, quote unquote, communist China that controls all the means of production, but then also the butt of all the jokes because everything is made without any fucking regulation?
Yeah.
How are those two things? Those are the most cognitively dissonant things that you could describe about a country, but that's what regularly gets described about China.
Except like 90% of our motherboards are manufactured in China. All of the processors lately have been manufactured in China. It seems our RAM is made in China. Our hard drives are made in China. What are the top 3 premium top tier phones, mobile devices? An iPhone, a Samsung Galaxy, and whatever that Pixel phone is, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Those are all probably made in China.
I think Samsung's made in Korea.
Oh, Samsung's probably made in Korea.
I think that's the only one that's not. Because then I think what is it? I think it's
is it LG?
Samsung, Vizio, which is like the Best Buy brand, and then LG, I believe, are made in Korea.
I bet Vizio uses whichever previous generation of LG or Samsung display panel technology.
I think it's all the same.
Yeah.
I think they're all. They just have the different. They get cheaper plastic frames on the LG or on the Vizio, and then, but they all come out of the same factory as far as I know. But then that's where there is shit coming out of Korea, but then most of it's coming out of China, and then the stuff that's coming out of China.
I wonder if we follow the supply chain to the Korean manufacturers, if
how much of their stuff's coming out of like how many of the parts are coming. Yeah, I bet a lot of the parts are coming, and that's what I was about to get at is because the parts are being manufactured in China and then shipped to Korea is why you have the local shit being made so cheaply in China, but then it's the construction of the parts.
Yeah, you're paying for a certain level of quality control and
right,
and
which is why then the microphone, like one of them might work out of fucking 5, but that's then you're only paying 1/5 of the price.
So I dissected that cheap Chinese microphone, and I determined that they were using like 50s era microphone capsule technology, and it was never going to work with whatever I had because there is just. Man, it had 3 conductor wire, and 2 of the conductors on the pinout, the XLR pinout, were together. Pin 3 wasn't even connected, so it was never actually going to be able to get power from the system properly. And then on the back plane, on the back of the microphone, only 2 of those 3 wires actually connected to the microphone, and the third connected to this metal. I guess it was an attempt at shielding, but it was attached to plastic, and it wasn't grounding out to anything else, and I'm pretty sure that that's not really a shielding. The only circuitry, and this is supposed to be a condenser mic, the only circuitry was on the back of the microphone, and it was the size of like a yuan, not a yuan, a juan, one of those really tiny coins, Chinese coins, like smaller than a penny, smaller than a dime. Mm-hmm. It was the tiniest, most like. Seriously, this is what they can ship? What the fuck? Oh. I also disassembled the shock mount. I want to put the air quotes up, but yeah, the shock mount that they sent wasn't really a shock mount. It's pieces of plastic, like hard plastic. It was more of just a hard suspension. Yeah, it was just arms that held the thing in place to look like a shock mount. It was definitely not what was in the pictures. So anyways, I removed those, and I cut up 2 rubber bands, and now it's a shock mount for the low additional price of like, I don't know, in China I bet it's like less than a penny, but for 2 rubber bands, it could have been a real shock mount.
That's crazy. But that's the difference between somebody who knows what they're doing and somebody who's just barely following instructions.
Yeah.
Because that's, what you did is clearly, it's functional, and you did it with the fucking rubber bands. But that's,
I did it with something that came for free with a piece of broccoli. Yeah. That probably came from California.
Well, and then it's shit like that where, you know, I think it's Elizabeth Warren. She's pushing a policy of, I don't know if it's just for farmers, but at least for farmers, their factory equipment is going to have to be made so that they can fix it themselves, because a lot of shit is made like Apple makes it so that only somebody who has their whatever 5.5 star screw can open their products.
Oh yeah,
like you have to have their proprietary.
I have a pentalobe screw. I also have a trilobe screwdriver set. I have all the tools to take apart Apple products. Not because I wanted to, but because you can't buy just one. You have to buy the entire set of each type of driver. I may be wrong. These things might have changed.
That's bullshit.
This may have changed because the last time I had to buy those kinds of tools and do anything like that was 10 years ago.
But then that's like a perfect example of a company that makes their technology intentionally inaccessible, so that then you have to go to the Genius store or whatever to get your shit fixed. And it's like, I get that it's creating jobs, but then
those the certifications are like, I think they're like $300 or more a pop, and you got to get them every year, I believe. And
well, but even then, that gets back to,
I mean, if you have all the certifications and you're like the top level Apple genius, you make a lot of money doing that. As computer techs go.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's like, I don't think that it'll ever compare to being like, like senior developer of a software company, or a senior developer.
I mean, nor should it, but
I don't think that it could ever compare to being like a mid-level developer at a software company, like a real one. So we're still talking about like, entry level of the IT industry. Still costs like over $1,000 a year to maintain certification. And that's just for like the luxury computer world. We're not even talking about like the real business.
But this is just gatekeeping.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with arbitrary licensing and control over hardware. Because, a lot of people don't even own their hardware. In whether it's, if you buy an Xbox or some shit like that, you don't own it. You're leasing it. That's why you can't mod it without breaking the law. And it's shit like that where you don't think about it until you know how to mod it, and then you're like, huh.
I'm really pleased that my Xbox 360 lease has only cost me like $45 over the last 3 years.
Yeah. I have a hard time buying any new hardware because of that. Like I just don't. Like I'm onto almost 100. Yeah, I guess 100% computer gaming now.
I still need to come over for a VR night.
Yeah. Well, this is a good topic. I think VR is in a weird place because it's gonna take. There's a learning curve to it. So when you get into VR, you have to basically relearn how to move.
Oh, that's a really good point. I remember the one time I tried that. I played that zombie game, and I was holding the controller the way that the controller was designed to be held, but I kept missing when I was shooting. And you're like, no, man, you have to aim. And so I repositioned the controller in my hand so that everything made sense to me in the game. And then everything was fine, and I could play, and I could shoot accurately. I could actually shoot really accurately.
Yeah.
But when I took the goggles off, or the headset off, and I looked the way I was holding the controller, it was like, whoa, how did I get this monkey grip to work?
Right.
And had I been looking at my hand, it wouldn't have worked. I would have been like, I would have struggled to maintain this weird articulation of my hand to get it to happen. But because I had somehow dissociated my hands in the game or in reality from the game. It was a very surreal experience.
So that dissociation you're talking about is one of the biggest hurdles that people have to overcome to get good at VR. And it's not easy because I think it takes, we have two hemispheres in our brain, obviously, but what's not so obvious is I think that there are quadrispheres that happen of activation in that. So somebody, as a good example,
like left front and right rear.
Right. So somebody who would be a good example is a drummer. So a drummer can ultimately have their four limbs activating in different they have to align them, but they can be doing different things at different paces because they ultimately have four motor controllers that they can coordinate with each other within the brain. So in that context, when you have to dissociate and reassociate with this new controller setup, there's going to be people who have natural predispositions to being better, and some people won't be able to do it at all. And I think that presentation of that framework is going to make it so that some people understand that they'll never be good at VR, but then if you have this thing that some people can never be good at, that completely reduces the profit potential for that thing.
Yeah, it becomes a big limiting factor.
Yeah, so I think that that's one of the reasons VR hasn't taken off in the first place.
Not just because the technology is
exactly.
Is already requires an additional
not just
investment.
the technology. It's that people. There's going to be some people who aren't even going to be able to be good at it ever. They just will never be able to be good at it. And after watching different people go in and perform at different capacities in the first experience, I can definitely see that some people will never cross the learning curve hurdle in a way that would be so frustrating that then their frustration is going to be directed to somebody else and prevent that person from ever trying it, because they would assume that their experience is ubiquitous and everybody's going to have that difficulty.
Oh man, like I can't imagine what it would be like to. No, I bet it's the kind of thing that if you just try to walk into somebody's saved game and you didn't get to that point and have like that kind of, or didn't even have the muscle memory to play the game, just walk into somebody else's saved game. That's terrifying.
I mean, I don't know how many hours I've put in VR at this point. So my experience with it is way different than most people's.
Yeah.
To the point that I know everybody gets motion sick when you first do it. It's something that you can't avoid because of the dissociation factor, because your eyes are seeing movement and your ears are not experiencing the same motion. So everybody's brain is going to have that motion sickness experience. But I trained it away over hours and hours and hours, but it was intentional as well. So I'm like, there's all these things about it that I've learned that then I'm looking at the technology as an enthusiast, like this is going to be a real hard sell for probably 60% of the population.
It's interesting. I tried playing Halo. And because that game was designed for a pre-HD playback or displays, it makes me just nauseous right away. But then when I play a game that's designed for Xbox 360, like Halo 4 or Ace Combat's the game that I play the most. And you'd think that a flying game would give you like the most severe kind of motion sickness, but that game I could just play that for hours. And it's really kind of odd. I think that there is.
Well, I think it depends on the type of flying game, because well, you can go ahead. I don't want to.
I was just saying that, like, I think that there's probably some element to it of, like, we don't. No matter what kind of lens system they put in front of you, no one's used to focusing within like 3 inches of their face.
Right.
Even if you wear glasses, you're not actually focusing 3 inches from your face.
No.
You're focusing as far out as the lens will allow.
Well, and but VR is kind of like a big magic eye.
I know, that's the thing. And my experience with it was when I looked through it, it made me feel like I was looking through like the 3D polarizing circle. What do they call it? When the concentric rings polarizing systems like they used for Avatar, or in the theaters, the 3D Real or Real 3D. So they use this really interesting polarization method to separate the right and left images, and they're using polarized lenses, a circular polarizing method, so that each eye only sees what you're supposed to see.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And that's what the VR interface reminded me of. It reminded me of this 3-dimensional polarized field, and I'm not sure. I think you'd have to spend a lot of time looking through polarizing filters and just rotating them and seeing how they work, or spending time looking through a circular polarizer like that. Maybe using the wrong word, concentric polarizer. But there was something about the way that it was working. Oh, maybe there was like a electronic shutter action going on. But I remember thinking that it was like very. There was an element of it that was not approaching reality enough. It wasn't like Nintendo's Virtual Boy or whatever that was, that weird goggle thing that you stuck your head in. It was definitely this an environment that I felt like I was in, but it looked like I felt like I was in a really low resolution environment, even though I know that it wasn't.
Right. No. I see what you're saying.
And so there was
a low resolution reality.
Yeah, that's it. And so there was. It wasn't so much that the motion wasn't smooth. It's that the objects themselves wouldn't translate. They wouldn't have enough information in the first place, because a rock wouldn't have the really subtle gradient shifts of light as you walk by it, because in that environment it still had a number of facets that you could count. Well, theoretically count. It might be in the thousands, and it might be a really odd number, but you can still count it in theory. Whereas a rock has infinite facets. And so there were little things that I'm sure that eventually ray tracing will become some part of this, and they'll figure out how to do it on a scale, and computers will be powerful enough eventually through some kind of really advanced hardware acceleration, hopefully, that it looks as real as it can get.
At the same time,
but we have to get there first.
I don't think that stuff actually matters when you're moving, because you're talking about inspecting a rock for detail, but when you're in motion, that rock is a smaller detail in a larger landscape. That there's like also a mental gap that I think you have to go in for like 2 hours or something before your brain can cross that mental gap, and it's like once you learn the locomotion in that world, then you have the capacity to move around more, and then you have less capacity to focus on the things that you would when you're still, and then the world becomes more immersive. So what you're talking about, I think, is an actual part of the curve, in that when you can't move around, whether it's due to motion sickness or not knowing how to move around, you're going to be looking at everything, and it's going to feel like you're
missing something
in a pixelated world, like you took some acid or some shit, and it's something wrong with the real world, and you're not past that uncanny valley yet.
Yeah.
But that's because you're standing still. And I think, it also depends on the levels turned up on your system. So I think in mine, I have it set for performance, so it will not have as much detail, so then it's smoother. Because then what happens is if it tries to load too much detail, then sometimes it bogs down the computer and it'll get choppy in the motion.
Microsoft or Sony tried VR, didn't they? They had a VR
They have
headset.
One. Yeah.
I think there has to be some kind of like balance where it's nice that people want to try and build a system, like a high-powered system, and try and beat the cost to performance curve, and build a system that's more capable than like a dedicated piece of hardware. But I also think that like the reason that video games are as incredible as they are is because they're building to a known quantity. Like video game developers know that an Xbox or a PlayStation can only do so much. And so they max that out.
But they don't know the limits until they get to them.
I know that's the thing. There are a lot of games though that every generation has like some game that pushes the envelope of how much can they cram into a game and that can still process without bogging down and becoming like a loading screen.
But this is the difference between console gaming and PC gaming in that. So when was the PS3 first came out, they were saying that it would be 4 to 5 years before they were able to actually produce anything that would be able to take advantage of the processing power in the game.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I think it's the same thing with every console in that when they put the console out, the only reason they're putting it out is because the console has the power to do some shit that is not available in the current market, and it will at least be that way for enough years to justify making an entire console. So that's where it's usually changes in the GPU or CPU or something that has happened that justify creating a new console. But then that's what happens is what you're talking about.
Xbox One didn't offer me enough of a reason to get an Xbox One.
Oh God, no!
Xbox 360 is more than adequate to do all the things that I actually need.
But that's because what you're talking about, those consoles, it was
really capable.
Well, but the Xbox One came after. I just did research on this subject. In fact, what happened was the evolution of systems from the Nintendo Entertainment System up to the first wave of 16-bit and then 64-bit. It happened really fast, sequentially. So then, but it didn't happen fast at first. But then once the 16-bit to 64 happened, all those things happened really fast.
Well, Sega released a 32-bit system, and then
it was
Nintendo
they released a 32X first, which was an add-on to the Genesis, and then they released the fucking Saturn.
Yeah, but they went to a 32-bit system, and then Nintendo's like, we're going straight to 64-bit.
Right, but that shit all happened in such a sequence.
But then here's the interesting thing: is that a PlayStation is a dual 32-bit system. They were using two processors. They had a coprocessor, and they were doing something that everyone else had stopped doing, because everyone else was like, hey, we don't have these limitations. Sony was like, I think they were doing something like the way that they locked everything into the clock cycle. They were doing it just a little bit different than everyone else, and they were able to get more out of basically they had like 24-bit sound before anyone else, and they were delivering a level of gaming that the detail didn't drop when it got complicated. It didn't slow down because it was just like in lockstep. Whereas I think that Nintendo's 64-bit system, you had to buy a RAM expansion if you wanted to play certain games,
right?
Because it wouldn't play them. You had
to. The thing that you're talking about is going to be the problem with VR.
32X was just a coprocessor that enabled a 16-bit system to function with a little bit more juice, but it wasn't actually a 32-bit coprocessor. It was just a hardware acceleration.
So here's the thing. What you're talking about right now with the 32-bit and 64-bit is the exact same problem with VR. But the issue is what has to be rendered is an environment simultaneously with a character that's responding to real-time input. So there's multiple things happening that if you have one processing unit, any processor is eventually going to get bogged down processing real-time input with rendering an environment and reactions to real-time input. So the solution to that is to move your processing to multiple locations. So one is processing the environment, one's processing the user, something else may potentially processing the input. So then all of your processing is not happening in the same place.
At that point,
and that
just
prevents
built a multi-processor, multi-GPU workstation.
This is where parallel processing started to happen at that time, which is where you start to get the quad cores and all the parallel processing theory started to happen at that time in computing, period. So there's all these things about computing that are changing that are also being applied in gaming, which some companies applied to their systems, like i.e. Sony, but Sega didn't apply them in their first builds.
That's why the Dreamcast was the Dreamcast was actually a really cool system.
Right.
It would play PlayStation games.
But you also had to have the add-on for the memory in your controller.
Yep.
So that's a perfect example as to where they couldn't have,
themselves.
I mean, but it wasn't that they screwed themselves. It's the timing of the hardware capacity started changing so fast that if you wanted to do certain things, you'd have to offload your hardware demands onto different parts, and that's where you'd have the add-on pieces and the add-on like memory chips and the memory sticks and all these things to make it so that the computer or the console was actually able to run the games.
The Dreamcast. My real complaint about the Dreamcast is that I didn't like the controller.
Mm-hmm.
I liked the system a lot. It was really smooth. It did everything really well.
They had different sizes of the controllers, and then once you had a smaller one, it was a lot better.
Yeah, but there was something about the way that it made me. I feel like I was just holding it. There was something about the way I had to hold it that I didn't like. And I couldn't get around.
Well, but then that's also if you did a different.
Yeah, I had to play that system. I had to like hold it down on my leg and like hold it with my palms, and then kind of use it like a keyboard almost.
Yeah, well, that's what like you're talking about that. Whenever I play Soul Calibur, and I wasn't the only one, but you can't use a traditional grip on that controller.
You got to do an overhand grip for Soul Calibur.
Yeah, and
you still have to do an overhand grip for Soul Calibur.
Yeah, for the most part. I can do I still prefer the thumb on a lot of that shit, but it's just not. There's gonna be somebody who has a superior advantage when they have the two fingers. But this gets back to again, you're having people put in input at such a high rate that if the processor is not able to handle their input, then it starts to slow down and the animations start to slow down. And then this is where people start to spam animations, shit like that. But this gets to like why VR already had like the headsets have processors in them, and then you have a computer doing a lot of processing in most cases, but then this where you have the Oculus Go.
I always thought that the headsets had their own computer in them.
Yeah,
they would have to.
But a lot of them have their own computer,
GPU.
And that it's also using the GPU in the computer. Yeah. So like mine is using the GPU in the computer and the fucking headset. But if you compare it to like an Oculus Go, mine's gonna be way more powerful. Yeah. But because the things are made specifically for Oculus Go, they might be smoother in some cases and have better detail because it's made specific.
Because they're optimized for that platform.
Exactly. And they know where the load is going to be and all these different things about the build, which is why then cross-platforming gets, some things work on PlayStation and they work okay on Xbox and then they don't work on the console that well at all.
That's the other thing, the fragmentation. It'd be one thing if they were all aiming at the same target.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not.
No.
They can't be.
And they shouldn't.
Well, they shouldn't be, yeah.
But that's where, again...
I think if Microsoft was really serious, they would want to do some kind of, like, HoloLens AR type VR hybrid where you still use a screen, but you also would...
see the world behind it.
You'd see everything else.
That's, I think, going to be the most... it's the most expensive right now, but it's going to be the most used once it's
Well, I mean, if you wanted
cheap.
to play a game, you'd just drop a black curtain and then turn the lights off and then play with the lights off, and then you can...
I mean, they have...
I feel like that's the way to go into VR mode. Just put the shutters on it. Put some shutters on it.
Right, but I think that's safer than the VR spaces where you free roam and play. Like I've seen there's multiple spaces where you could go in and do VR gaming in the same room with other people, but it gets super sketch because then people don't know. Like you see the avatar of other people, but sometimes it may be slightly off and think you're 2 feet away when actually you're 1.5 feet away, and you raise your hand and hit,
you whack them.
Yeah, that seems like a fucking insurance nightmare to me. So that's kind of where I don't think those places are going to take off.
If I was going to envision a game that was trying to hybridize VR, AR experience and have a physical environment to interact in, it would have to be some kind of it would have to be some kind of Ghost in the Shell type shit, where you are, you're on patrol, and then you get some update, and when you get the update, your headset shutters go dark, and you start seeing information on the screen, and you press a button to open the shutters and re-engage with the environment. And we're talking about a, several city block by several city block adult, crime detective themed playground.
Yeah.
And so inside this place there are shops. There'd be like music shops.
Yeah.
There'd be a shopping district. There'd be a restaurant district. There'd be a nightclub district. There'd be a business district. And each place would have its own stories where you interact with some kind of like AI that's all virtual, but all the people in the game are other players like you working on their own side quest.
Yeah.
And
so what you're saying, I think, is ultimately going to be the pinnacle of like the theme park level.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at
this
is
is definitely a theme park. I'm not talking
the
about
only problem is
how do we bridge
you
that?
can't, if you're a first time user, you can't do it for more than 10 minutes without wanting to puke. So then immediately you have to break your immersion because of the motion sickness.
Well, yeah, that's
so
that's why AR would be the critical aspect.
Right.
And they expect you
but
to,
even AR,
yeah,
it may be 20 minutes because again, it's like I don't know if this version they're gonna have to get it so tested that a person is not going to get motion sick
and just puke
60+% of the time for X amount of minutes for people to justify paying for it. Any amount of money. But this gets to be what you're saying is if they can get that done, then it becomes this whole thing of you could go anywhere in a fucking warehouse. You could go to Tatooine. You could go to fucking the surface of the sun.
Yeah.
And everybody's Dr. Manhattan. And your game is just the fucking capacity of your mind on any planet, on any dimension, but it's in a warehouse.
I think that one of the first games that will be made at this level would actually be Jumanji.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I mean, and what ends up happening is with VR or AR, you can take any concept or literary universe and just go in it.
Yeah.
At that point, and that's the beauty of it. And then it's this is the problem with games. You can't just do that with games.
In this moment, Geordie LaForge becomes the most replicated or most cosplayed character in all of VR Star Trek history, like in an instant. Because
that's hilarious.
Or you want to be Locutus? I mean, really, you got to be Geordie. Geordie's way like you don't want to be the Borg. And you can't.
I mean,
but Geordie comes with his own goggles. It already makes sense.
You can be whatever you want.
I know.
And that's the beauty of it. Well, again, I don't know if you've tried the Star Trek VR yet.
No,
they have the Star Trek Bridge Crew VR, where you can fucking be the captain, you can be the helmsman, you can be the engineer. But it's all done from consoles. But the captain's sitting in the captain's chair. You're fucking giving orders to the crew. You're, you're pulling up the display, hitting the buttons. And when you're in the midst of a battle with fucking Klingons, you feel like you're on a fucking ship. Like pull up the view screen.
Oh, man,
and it's like in the middle of it, you let yourself be immersed in a way where that's being on the fucking captain or the ship, the captain of the Aegis or the Enterprise or some shit.
In my everlasting quest to understand the processing of audio and make the stuff sound interesting, I was researching reverb and modulation effects, and I discovered this technology that Roland developed at some point. And it was this RSS technology, and it allowed them to pan beyond the normal hard panning points. Like you could go beyond right or beyond left, but it allowed them to do these really interesting things, like change the relative position, like make it seem like the sound is coming from above or below you. And they do this by adding like comb filtering and modulating delay of incoming signal to influence the comb filtering So you can now, with one of these processors, there's a way to make sound move up and down and left and right and backwards and forwards. And so in my mind, it's like, I wonder if there's a way to plot CC messaging so that it does really complex arcs.
Oh, for sure. Well,
And or if it would be as simple as just in controlling 3 encoders to do X, Y, and Z axis, and then figuring out how to sweep those around. To get those kinds of sweeps.
I'm sure it's automated already because I can give you an example of in movies, because of the way the theater's set up, they have location-based sound that will be relative to what's happening on screen. So there was an example where somebody,
Sure, but those
I
are,
think it was like a,
but those are built for a surround sound system.
right.
This
But what I'm saying
RSS is all stereo.
what I'm saying is that algorithm is it's doing the same thing. So it doesn't matter if it's on stereo or if it's on surround sound. The sound is moving in the same arc, and the systems are going to represent it the way they represent it or not. But in the real world, the human's perception is all that matters. So if you get the perception of something going over your head in that arc, your body's going to react to it.
No,
so there's going to be different ways to produce that arc.
There's. I'm not arguing that it can't be achieved with a surround sound system, but they're doing it purely with psychoacoustic effect, and with a purely stereo sound source, they're able to recreate this kind of motion.
Right.
And they abandoned the pursuit of the technology.
I mean, but I'm saying the sound in space is moving in the same place.
Sure.
So it's doing the same thing. So what I'm saying is the waves in space are doing the same thing.
No, I get that.
So that's why it's like the outcome.
I understand that the spectral density is the same, and that there's actually probably a more sophisticated process that goes into combining a surround sound matrix. That's not what
I think it's less. I think it's less sophisticated in that because everything is already located in space, the trajectory is just a matter of adjusting the acoustics through the relative speakers to make it so that it's actually producing.
That's the thing, is this is able to produce through psychoacoustics what normally requires a surround sound matrix.
Right.
That's why it's really interesting to me. But they abandoned the technology because apparently nobody could figure out how to do anything except use the presets. And
well, human ears just aren't that good, so nobody's gonna.
The only people that could hear it were people in production studios.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to have pristine monitoring, and you had to have an acoustically treated room just to be able to hear the effect.
Classically trained ears, because the problem is humans can't tell the difference between front and back,
or even up
and down. Well,
yeah.
Like, because if they've done tests, if you blindfold them, they just can't tell. Because then what happens is when somebody's trying to be a witness for a crime, if they don't have a visual reference for a sound, they have no way to actually tell.
Yeah.
Because so there's all these things about it as to why that. You know, this is again an example of awesome technology that just doesn't work because humans.
I mean, the point is obviously very cool, and so to me, it's like, oh yeah, you do this, you create the audio, you process it so it does this thing, and then you have to process the living crap out of it even more to make it obvious. Because if this kind of thing, which is originally intended to be subtle, so you could like carefully place an object in a soundstage. Mm-hmm. That didn't work. There's got to be a way to like turn it up like all the way, or put like insane amounts of compression behind it to make it like super obvious. So it's not just like, so it actually becomes like a character, like a fingerprint, more than a fingerprint, like an actual hand or an arm, you know, something that has some mass to it. Mm-hmm. In terms of sound. But there weren't any devices that really did it that are accessible anymore. And they're like, they disappeared. It's one of those things that like we've gone through periods of technological development where we ended up with these really sophisticated tools that nobody really used, and now it's like no one knows or no one cares. It's not going to matter.
Well, part of it is what do you do with it? Because then it's what is that tool? You have to also have the creative capacity to then place that tool in a context that makes it useful in a way that's not just the novelty of the new tool.
Yeah.
And that's the same with VR.
Yeah.
A lot of the games at first were just crap, and the design was shit. So.
Yeah, that game that I was interested in, Eve Valkyrie, I believe they announced that they were going to stop doing it, I think. Or maybe there was a first-person shooter, too. Maybe that was the one they canceled. I can't remember. I remember when I looked up the VR requirements, my computer, because at the time I think I was using some like test CPUs.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have an official like ID number, and so it was like we can't do it. And I looked up the processor where they're supposed to be, and they should be able to do it, but they didn't want to read them. And then the real limitation is my video card. It's like one step below the minimum requirements. I need a 1060 Ti or something like that, a GTX 1060 to make it just work. So
yeah,
I'm pretty sure that I have enough processor though. If I had a badass video card, I would plug it into my dual processor system, because I'm pretty sure that thing has like headroom for days.
Mm-hmm.
The only time I've ever seen it go to 100% is during the installation of software.
VR definitely pushes it though.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things that is more than just GPU heavy. I feel like that should be like a really CPU heavy processor.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Like, I can't imagine that something, you're trying to recreate an environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot, actually. That's the thing. Like, when I look at a tree, like there's a lot going on when I look at them.
Right.
And even when I don't look at them, I know that there's a lot there.
Yeah, and in most cases,
how does the system even anticipate that you're going to decide to look at something?
Well, that's what I was gonna say. I think in most cases it renders the entire local environment, which is why it's so heavy, in that it can't anticipate where you're gonna look. So if you happen to like
sneeze,
if you happen to sneeze, you still have to have a smooth frame rate wherever your head happens to land, and it can't just drop out. So it's rendering every place in your local environment. So if you happen to just snap your head left or right, it's gonna be smooth. But that's why the preloading may take a couple minutes in some environments. Like I played Fallout 4. I mean, I still play it every so often, but in VR, it takes probably 3 minutes to load an environment, but then it's loaded for the entire local area.
I imagine there's like huge RAM requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you can run with 8 gigs, but I put it in 16, and it's definitely smoother. I imagine with like 32 it would be super smooth, but even with 16 my shit gets a little bogged down, and if there's a lot of action happening, it may slow down and skip.
Yeah.
But that's, I think that's just going to happen to anybody's system when, it depends if you're playing online or something. Because I do enjoy online gaming in VR, because it's like you get a better sense of, I feel like the 1990s arcade sentiment, it was on online gaming with consoles for a while, but then there's just too many people just making it fucking toxic. I feel like it's in VR.
An arcade is a very interesting place.
Because people are civilized in arcades.
You have to have a very limited type of game for an arcade to work, and then you have to have more than just the games. There has to be like the ticket returning prize games where you interact.
Food.
Food. That's where like the idea of a barcade is nice, but I don't think that alcohol and video games is a good idea. Some people might disagree with me. Like, I just don't think it's a good idea to sit a bear anywhere near a classic console.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have like extra small bar table stool situation right behind the games?
Probably. I mean, I haven't been to a Dave and Buster's, but
See, I went to the I guess I don't know what the place is in Jillian's or
yeah.
I went to that place one time, and that place is huge, and it was really fun. And I still remember like always looking for an appropriate place to set my drink down because I didn't want to. There's part of me that's like, you don't set the beer down on the air hockey table. You don't set it down on the video game. How do I get into this driving game? Where do I put my beer? There's no cup holder because games aren't built like a video game console or the arcade type game systems aren't designed with cup holders.
Right.
Because you're not supposed to put drinks on them anyways. And I think the only other place that I see those kind of games are like at Six Flags or Great America or whatever, an amusement park where they have giant cups overflowing from trash containers, and people are just running around spending money, and so that $9 drink doesn't matter. You're just gonna get another one. Just throw it away. You want to play games? You're gonna spend $20. Yeah, I think it's like $1 to play most games at a place like that.
I don't know, because I'm just...
Last time I was at a theme park was a long time ago, so I'm not sure.
I don't even understand, when you have consoles and computers that run...
Laps.
Yeah, laps around.
Hot laps
around. I don't know what's the point of arcade gaming except for the social experience, and that's where what I'm feeling now is like the VR online is where you get that social experience, because then you have because of the...
I think the only reason that those things can even exist is to satisfy some sense of nostalgia that a certain generation of gamers have.
Right.
Because for a long time, that was the only way to play games with other people in a meaningful way, because nobody else had a giant screen like that you get on a big arcade system. I mean, nobody would plug their console into their Nintendo, their Atari. Even if you did, you wouldn't be plugging it into your dad's giant television.
No.
Like,
no, because it would ruin...
It would just toast the tube.
They would warn you about trying to fucking play video games on those things, too. And I would always try to do it on the big screen when my parents went home. And it's like...
Tempting fate.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was like the only way you could really like play games. I mean, like in Simpsons or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, those were really fun to play with groups of people. And so I think that's the reason those things exist.
Well, it's funny because I actually just recently watched
only for
playthroughs of the old arcade games.
Yeah.
And if you have unlimited quarters, it takes like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But because of when we were young, it felt like forever because we could never have enough quarters to get through the entire game and also be good enough at the same time to only take a couple quarters.
Yeah.
Because then I played Michael Jackson's Moonwalker at an airport.
So awesome.
It's awesome as fuck. But the airport had a row of games that were free, so it was like Marvel vs. Capcom.
You
Michael
just
Jackson.
Go there and throw down.
Oh fuck yeah!
Oh,
and it made being at the airport so much better.
What airport is this?
Was it in Paris? Might have been Paris.
Man, those French people,
I can't remember.
They know how to do that international.
It was definitely
traveling.
some European. I think it was Paris. If I'm not mistaken.
Wherever this is. Oh, that sounds great.
No, it was because I got a fucking baguette sandwich there.
Was it in the international
100%.
terminal at Charles de Gaulle? Or did you have to like leave the terminal and go somewhere else to get to it?
I think it was at a different terminal.
Whatever terminal.
Well, no, because I was waiting to go to Mauritius, so it must have been the international terminal. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But yeah, they had fucking video games
You hear
there
that, IND?
for free. It made, dude, it made because I was there for probably 5 or 6 hours waiting, and being able to just play video games for free for that entire time.
So
Because
you beat Moonwalker then?
I did. I definitely beat Moonwalker because that was part of it. I'd never beaten it before in the arcade. You had the Genesis version, but I never beat the arcade version.
The arcade version was so much better.
But yeah, and then actually being able to play it, I think it took me maybe an hour.
Yeah.
But that was pretty long for an arcade game.
Man, I remember. So when I was really young, my mother was going to Stanford, and the student union at Stanford has a video game hall. And so when I was a kid, I would spend hours there just playing games. And I remember one time playing Moonwalker, like I show up and I start playing, some college students playing, and they're like, they've got to go to class. And they're like, hey, I've got to go to class. Can you handle this? I was like, yeah, I got this. So I'm like using both controllers and playing two characters. Eventually I lost one of them because you can't play two characters in that game and actually like be serious. It's just too hard. But for a brief period of time, I remember playing that game thinking like, I'm the baddest because I had two fucking Michael Jacksons. And you know when he gets like powered up and turns into the robot, that's the best part.
Yeah.
That's the absolute best part.
Did you ever see the actual movie?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that movie is good for Michael Jackson.
Like Joe Pesci.
Oh yeah, Joe Pesci in there too.
He's like so diabolical.
Yeah. Well, Michael Jackson's like Captain EO, and then he did the Halloween one. His films were fun for kids, and then that's where again, I think when you're a kid and then go back and look on those things as an adult, you can suspend disbelief enough to look at it with kids' eyes. But I think that's one of the problems adults have with a lot of newer stuff, because like with the CW, like I'm excited for Stargirl. Like I never thought in any fucking universe I'd be like excited for Stargirl, but I can suspend disbelief enough to look at that shit with my kid eyes to enjoy it and not be too critical about the fucking wigs or the acting or any specific part of it, to be like, oh, this is fucking, like, no, if you look at it as a kid, this
supposed
would
to be fun.
It is, exactly. And
It's supposed to be campy.
These
are comic books.
Exactly. And then, but it's hard for adults to do that in a lot of cases. So I think it's still an element of being able to do that is good for being able to enjoy media, but at the same time, it also helps me stay creative and then be creative in a way that's not going to just stick to my own demographic taste, because then if I can only write or produce content for my own demographic, then that pigeonholes me into like nerdy fucking comic book people, and that's not a huge demographic. And that's kind of where, I think in a sense people want to they want to work for their people, but it's only going to help your people if you connect with others outside of your group. So that's kind of, I remember writing a paper, and there was a class on adaptations that I had to take I didn't have to take this specific class. I had to take some elective, and I took a class on adaptations, and I wrote a paper on comic book movies and how they were completely different than the comic books, but because this was at the time when Marvel was like almost completely out of business, and the fucking X-Men bullshit was out, and I was not happy with those things. But in the paper, I'm saying, as a comic book fan, if these shitty movies are what it takes to keep them making comic books, I'm completely fine with that. I'm not going to shit on the people who go and watch the shitty movies. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut while this is going down, while this fucking bullshit Spider-Man 2 and 3 are coming out. I'm not going to publicly shit on them, because otherwise Marvel's going to go out of business. So I mean, I didn't use that language, but it's, I got a good grade on it. Anyway, in that framing, I feel like my adult self was reconciling with protecting the things that my childhood self enjoyed by not trying to shit on them as an adult if they did not come to my adult standards on other things that weren't intended for child audiences. So it's like, obviously things like X-Men or Spider-Man or Avengers, they're geared for families, so it's for children and adults. So they have to have some level of complexity that appeals to adults, but it's mostly for the kids. So you can't be going into an Avengers film expecting some philosophical revelation that changes your life unless you're like 7. You know what I mean?
We're not taking a dig or a jab at 7-year-olds.
No.
This.
I'm saying for a 7-year-old, they're going to have their ethical foundations being laid at that age. So if you go into Black Panther and see this dude fucking giving his life for what he has is this really complex idea of defending this ideal, but he's actually a bad guy, and you realize that by the end. If you're 7, Black Panther is going to have a dramatic ass effect on your understanding of what's good and evil and what's justifiable good and what's justifiable evil. Yeah. And in that shit is going to really affect young people. But if you're like 35, it shouldn't be that prolific. All these people coming out like, man, fucking Killmonger was woke as you shouldn't be that changed by Killmonger. You should have had that whole fucking dialogue yourself. And this should just be some like, oh, this is cool to see on screen. This is cool to see Michael B. Jordan doing this on screen. Because I had this idea when I was like 25 or 23 and realized why it was a terrible idea.
So my one reflection on Killmonger in Black Panther, when he requests a quick death so that he can be like his ancestors who jumped off the boat. The ancestors who jumped off the boat.
Well, I thought about that too.
I keep getting when I
thought about that too, but that doesn't mean just because somebody jumped off a boat doesn't mean they didn't procreate before they got on the boat.
That's true.
I thought about that as my
just keep thinking about
modern self who is trained to critique and rip apart everything, and in that
that's
concept,
where you landed.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was my. It's like, because then it's like everybody who was shipped off was not necessarily everybody that was there, and that person could have had offspring before they left.
Okay.
Which is also in the context of.
Otherwise, I really enjoyed his character.
Well,
that was the only thing. That was like at that point. Like,
I think a lot of people had
seriously,
a problem with
like,
that.
I'm watching it right up at the end. It's like, okay, he's like, just kill me now, and he said that thing about the boat, and it's like, wait, what? And that was like a brick wall moment for me.
Yeah.
And so, of course, it picks right back up afterwards because at the moment you just ignore that crap and you just move on.
Right.
But there was this. Every time I've watched it since, I keep coming back to that point. It's just like, why did they write it like that?
Well, because then even then, so think of this way: if you have 2 brothers on a boat, one jumps off and dies, and then the other brother goes and procreates, the one that died is still an ancestor.
Yeah, no,
they don't have to be your direct progenitors to be.
No, they can be some deeply distant cousin.
Yeah, like it don't have to be
like a 4th cousin 5 times removed or something like that.
And that's still an ancestor.
Yeah.
As long, I think technically ancestor is anyone you're related to that was born before you and died before you.
Okay.
Technically, like I think because in that, people delineate ancestry as your family tree and. the lineage of the people that are related and how they are related. So it does not necessarily mean that it's like your direct progenitor, because then, like I'm saying, if it's your like grandfather's uncle, your grandfather's uncle is still your ancestor.
Yeah.
But your grandfather's uncle he's not your direct line.
Yeah. No, it's like a different branch.
Yeah.
On a bigger branch.
Right. But that's why again, ancestry is weird in its construct, because there's this element of, if it depends on how you look at it.
Oh, like the hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
Is pretty big too. I met a cousin. Here would be my cousin, but in China I'm his uncle because I'm on the level above somehow, like the way that the generations work.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like a year older than me, but I'm in the generation that about before his.
So you're still his uncle.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens.
That's some interesting math.
Well, that happens in
I
certain
thought it
cases
was cool.
still,
Actually,
too.
I thought it was kind of amusing. He kept calling me uncle. I was like, dude, gotta quit that. I'm not. You're older than I am. It's like I get it that it's like a cultural respect thing, but he's like, my name is Tien. Just call me Tien. That's what I'm used to. And then he called me Tien. It was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, when people get remarried, especially, there's the possibility of some weird uncle aunt relationships happening where somebody's like
Related.
Especially if somebody has grandkids and they remarry and have another kid, then that new kid could be somebody's aunt or uncle, but it's like a baby.
Yeah.
And that shit happens frequently. But that's an actual...
I don't think these are modern constructs either. I think this kind of stuff's been going on since.
Yeah, that's weird, right?
Since like the dawn of
that's
baby
weird
making.
As fuck. That you can have an aunt or uncle that's younger than you.
Yeah.
And it's still biologically accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah, those constructs are clearly outdated based on, I don't know when they became outdated, but they're clearly outdated.
Well, I'm sure that the one that the Chinese have been using is like 1,000+ years old.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's been around for a while.
Yeah, and they just keep using it for the sake of tradition. But
nobody can come up with a better way of doing the math. It's too complicated.
Yeah,
they just keep it simple for the first couple generations, and after that, it's like the same, basically, because nobody lives that long.
Yeah, not now. Well, and that's...
Some places people live a long time now. I was reading like the average age is still going up. The max age for a human is still like 120 something, but the averages are still, they're still good. We
can't help but procreate though, so why do we need to?
We don't need to live a long time
if we keep procreating, and that's the problem that humans, if our lifespan has been going up increasingly for the last 100 years, and our procreation rate has ballooned. Obviously, there's also death by proxy of all these other factors that are happening to keep the growth rate sort of in check, but even then, it's not in check.
I feel like if I can expect to live to be in my 90s, that means 45 is middle age. 45 is a reasonable time. I mean, I feel like I knew so many people who had kids when we were just out of high school or right out of college, or still in the early 20s. People were having children, and lo and behold, their kids are graduating from high school now.
Yeah.
Or they're graduating from college.
I think that used to be the acceptable time to have kids.
Well, at one point, everyone moved out of their parents' house when they were 18. But then that changed, and then it was not the case. And then I remember at one point reading something about how people were still living with their parents well into their 30s, which apparently is the norm in parts of Europe.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of people who aren't from America are like, what? Really? That's how you do it?
Yeah, like my sister owns a house but lives with my parents, so...
That's actually kind of weird. I mean, actually, and when I think about it, I actually wouldn't. I would totally live with my parents. They always make really good food.
So yeah,
My dad's always got a pot of chili or beef stew cooking. Actually, lately it's been like ham and bean soup, which is still really good.
Yeah, there's always some nostalgia effect with parents cooking that you can't get from other versions of that same dish. That's funny, you know. The same shit happens with grandparents cooking.
Speaking of grandparents cooking, there's a brand of cookies called Grandma's, and these are like the most moist.
Her grandma's chocolate chip cookies are delicious.
They are delicious, but they're like not completely baked. They're like I pulled some out of the container or out of the package, and like it was like collapsing in my hand, and it was still like it looked like it hadn't been completely baked. So I threw it in the toaster oven, and like on toast level 4 for like 4 or 5 minutes, and it came out. It was fantastic. Like the chocolate morsels had all started melting, but they hadn't lost their shape. It had completed caramelizing the butter, saturated butter section of the cookie deep enough that it could hold itself together. The only problem was that I didn't clean the toaster before, and so I had this slight, aroma of pizza. It's like a pepperoni chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah, that shit happens, man.
But it was still really good. And so I did it with a peanut butter cookie, and peanut butter cookie can handle a whole lot more heat for longer because it's got all that peanut butter oil. Mm-hmm. And then I tried it with the oatmeal raisin, and it totally screwed it up because that doesn't have nearly as much going on, and it just like crisped up the outside and scorched it, turned it black on the outside. But because it was such a moist cookie on the inside, it was still sweet and delicious on the inside. And when I dipped it in milk, it gave the milk this really distinct like cinnamon, raisin, almost coffee flavor. It was really kind of weird. I didn't expect the coffee flavor. Maybe it just reactivated my cup.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what different combinations of foods will release in the palate to make it, greater than the individual parts.
Well, I feel like I engaged in some really low level, molecular gastronomy, because I put some ingredients together and ended up with something that tasted completely different. Somehow I synthesized the flavor of coffee in my milk that I was dunking my burnt grandma's oatmeal raisin cookies in.
Yeah. Coffee smells really versatile too. Yeah.
So I've been doing this cold brew method for the past year. I'm at this point where I've used 4 scoops, which I'm pretty sure is 8 tablespoons of coffee. And then I add water and I let it sit overnight, about 12 hours. You're drinking a 11-hour and 40-minute coffee. And I've tried different types of coffee, and I keep coming back to this Kroger French roast giant tin for $5. Mm-hmm. And the reason I like it is that when I do this cold brew, by the time I'm ready to pour it through the strainer and then the filter, because I use a reusable filter, most of the grounds have sunk to the bottom of the container, and so I only have to scoop off 2.5 of the, or no, maybe 1.5 of the original scoops of coffee grounds, and they're all sopping wet, so it's like just throw them away. But the rest of it stays pretty much at the bottom, and it's really surreal because in my mind it's like, yeah, this is Kroger, this is the generic brand of coffee. But I've tried fancier coffees, and a lot of times they leave a lot of material floating. There's a lot of like the husk of the bean, or the actual shell of the bean is still present, or it's ground so fine that...
Oh yeah, the grind makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, working in a coffee shop, like, I think it was like 7, it's either 7 or 9 different settings on the grinder.
Yeah.
And if you're one off, it's gonna
change everything.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I found that Kroger's French roast is actually extremely consistent.
mm.
I think they must be grinding up like a barrel of beans at a time or something dumb.
Well, and I'm finding out you need way less coffee than you think.
You need.
Yeah, because otherwise it doesn't have enough space to get through the particles. Because even in like the K cup or the like we fill our own K cups and reuse them, so it's environmentally friendly that way.
Yeah.
Because then the individual cups are you're not wasting any coffee because you're not brewing six cups at a time or whatever, how many are in a pot. I guess you can change the different number of cups, but I used to brew pots and then the last 2 cups would go to waste because it would be sitting there for a couple hours and it's fucking stale and gross, and you try to drink it and it's disgusting.
That's why I really like this cold brew method where it never gets hot. It just turns into coffee. And if I heat it up, it still has that kind of sweet flavor because I'm no longer passing hot water through the beans.
Yeah.
I'm just heating up the bean nectar.
Yeah. Well, because then
What's really interesting is that I found that if I heat up a cup of this stuff, the cold brew, in the microwave for about 2 minutes and 10, 20 seconds, really just depends on if I'm impatient. But if I heat it up just enough, I don't have to add anything, and it's kind of sweet. It's really weird. Because it also helps if I haven't had anything to eat or drink and I haven't altered the way my palate's working yet.
did they add some stuff in the roast? Because sometimes they add chocolate or some shit.
No, it's like a tin that you pull the vacuum seal. It's like an industrial grind of coffee.
I mean in the actual bean roast, because I'm saying when they roasted it, like when you bought the tin, did you read what they roasted it with on the box? Or
no,
on the
it just
back?
says French roast.
Yeah, because sometimes it'll be like hints of hazelnut or chocolate because they roast.
Oh no, it doesn't have any of that stuff. I'm not into hazelnut.
I mean, it's not like a flavored coffee, but you can only actually taste it.
Oh, that's interesting.
If you really like.
Well, in that case, I'll need to look it up because I didn't recall.
Because what happens is a lot of times they'll say shit like, cocoa roasted beans, and it doesn't taste like chocolate, but you can only taste the cocoa when it's like, very specific circumstances, and it's not going to come through all the time.
Well,
it's
that's
not
interesting
come
because
through every time
the cold brew method is supposed to be like the least acrid, which would allow the most complex version of the flavor to actually come through. So that makes sense.
or the bitterness isn't going to stamp out everything else.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where, again, like I'm assuming the cold brew is going to be the best for actually tasting those undertones that are supposed to be there in a lot of those coffees that you can't actually taste unless you add sugar when it's hot.
Wow.
Because again, when you add sugar to those, then you can taste them.
Yeah, it changes everything. Once you add sugar.
Yeah. And it is not even like a ton of sugar, but just enough.
No, you can
to bring it out.
If you start with like a wet teaspoon, or like if you stir your coffee with a teaspoon, and then you like just dip the edge in it, like the Chinese stir fry technique, you can get just like half of a teaspoon just of what it coats. That's enough. Not even that, like less than that. Just the tip of the spoon even is probably sufficient.
Well, it's like
that's actually the reason I can't handle those like Coffee Mate. The scariest thing about that stuff is that it's got so much corn syrup in it. Is that whatever remains in the bottom of the glass, that basically a cup turns into plastic.
Yeah, it's
weird
gross.
Corn syrupy stuff that like you almost have to dig at it with your fingernail at sometimes because it'll get so thick. And I've seen people just pour like half of a glass of creamer, like French vanilla. I don't even want to think about how much sweetener has to be in some of that stuff because when I smell it, I feel like I'm smelling like raw candy that hasn't gone through the forming process.
Yeah, processed sugar is fucked, man. I don't know how it's still such a that and plastic for that matter. You know, there's so many things that are still part of our lives, like junk mail, like that shouldn't be
How
part
does
of
that
our
even
lives
make money?
anymore.
Like, I can't imagine that anyone's actually like going for the pack mail or multi mail pack or whatever the hell it is. Like, that's got to be the weirdest version of advertising.
Yeah.
Like, I think surely the people would be it would be worth it to people to not have to get that kind of stuff, or maybe that's the kind of thing that keeps the mail route in full effect. By having to deliver that stuff regularly, it keeps.
No, so this is the crazy part. So the United States Post Office has a mandate that doesn't allow them to be profitable in a way that exploits their services, which is a great thing. But that also means that they're basically operating
in the red all the time.
Yeah. So that's why when they get shit about their operating budget, it's not their fault for many reasons, but then it's a fucking government service. Like, the whole reason we have it on every day, well, the main reason we have it on Sundays now is because of Amazon originally.
Yeah.
But
Amazon's pulling out of that. They got their own shipping system.
Well, but now they're still going on Sundays. So
okay.
It's like what ends up happening is the whole reason we have it every day now is because it's a government organization and it's funded by taxes. And this is where if it were FedEx, if it operated like FedEx and if it were a private organization, then there'd be days potentially where they wouldn't be able to operate because their fucking budget would be fucked. Or they'd have to jack up their prices, and then they'd have this, fluctuating charges that, if gas goes up, then they're going to charge a lot more. Whereas now, if you buy a Forever stamp, you can always fucking mail your shit. Even though they're going to raise prices for Forever stamps gradually with the cost of gas. But
Forever stamps are not a good speculation.
Right. Definitely not. Well, that's where I think it was Ponzi originally was doing stamps, if I'm not mistaken. Because that whole that's one of the reasons they had to start fixing the price. But again, there's all this stuff about.
I mean, would it even have been possible to buy like $100,000 of Forever stamps?
Oh fuck yeah!
So you buy $100,000 worth of Forever stamps, and you wait for the value of it to go up to twice what it is, and then you've got $200,000 worth of Forever stamps from 50 years ago.
I mean, and when you're selling them to immigrants that are mailing letters back and forth, you're making a shitload of money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not. This sounds crazy now.
Wait, this is like the weirdest version of laundering money that I've ever heard of.
Yeah. Well, I'm fairly positive it was stamps. It was either stamps or money orders. It was one of those two things. But regardless, there are things put in place to prevent somebody from like buying up all the stamps and then sitting on them until they go up in price and then reselling them to fuck up the stamp market, because then that would negatively impact the post office. But then because of that, then you get collecting built around it, and then there's all these things that are then the byproduct of this cascading effect of legislation on an industry.
I wonder, do you think Forever stamps are tracked at a level where they know they get down to like only, say, 1,000 Forever stamps haven't been used? It's time to print up a new batch of Forever stamps? Or do you think that they print them up regularly and allow currency exchange to happen all the time?
I think they probably print them regularly and let them happen all the time, just because they'd have.
It's not really.
They have limited runs.
Yeah.
Of specific types of Forever stamps, but that's where. But then they'll have one that's like the generic all the time one that's not a special run. Like it'll be like a Liberty Bell or an American flag or some shit. Yeah, like so I feel like an American flag is probably.
That's like Ripple. They'll just print more of it when they need more of it.
Right. Yeah, and then
so
if
holding it's not really it might be an option over like 100 years.
Only special edition.
Yeah, and only because you're expecting an economy to
but they're not going to lose value either, and that's the benefit of them is like you'll always be able to sell them for roughly what you got them for.
Unless you were foolish enough to buy a bunch of them at some rate that was exorbitant because you bought them in the middle of the wrong time.
But that's also why they do the special runs to make it more difficult to copy or to counterfeit them.
Oh yeah.
So it's like, if they do the Rosa Parks edition, then if you're gonna counterfeit Forever stamps, you're gonna have to make sure that it's the numbers that align with the ones that they did for this specific. Like I don't know, I haven't looked at a Forever stamp in a minute. I don't think they put serial numbers on them.
Is so strange. We have coins that are valued at a fixed rates all the time, and then we release special editions of those coins that are dual value. They're like the value of the coin, or triple value. They're the value of this face value of the coin on the street. There's the value of the coin because it's a special edition, and then there's the value of the silver that they put into them, because a lot of those special edition coins are just a block of silver that's been pressed.
Right.
And so, in the hands of the wrong person, a quarter might just be a quarter, but it could also be like $5 for the special edition collector, and it could also be like $7 to the silver collector.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's
nuts.
What you're talking about is one of the problems with value as to why when it costs more to mint nickels and we keep minting them for the sake of tradition and keeping tradition alive than stopping minting them and changing our approach, there's an element of I'll call it national theater, that is part of preserving the notion of the nation. And in that, you have things that are meant to keep people identifying as American to then be able to establish narratives that identify others for whatever reason, whether it's for terrorists locally or communists globally. But if you don't have the capacity to establish the national identity, then you can't impose those narratives. And it's in presenting it's like the thing gets reinforced every day through news cycles that seemingly are disconnected, but it's the same thing over and over with different stories bolstering those aspects of what it's doing. So it'll be like it's reinforcing your mortality by reminding you that you can die, by telling you about someone else's death, reinforcing your need for altruism by telling you about some feel-good story about something, like, for example,
it's like vicarious affirmation of belief or something.
Yeah. Like that. But then it's going through all the different emotions that will then affirm you as a good American.
Good, great. Well, what does that say about people that are all about like crime and murder porn? All they want to do is watch people. I mean, I know there are people out there that all they want to do is watch home improvement shows, but there are also people out there that are just watching, crime television, and some of it's like, documentary presentation.
Yeah,
that's the stuff that actually kind of worries me, is that there's an entire subset of television media that, and I'm not complaining about detective shows where they solve crimes, and I know that there's like a fantasy element to it, but like the stuff where it's like, this happened on such and such a date, and so didn't see it coming, blah blah blah. Like they paid for the worst narration writer imaginable, and I just feel like there's just so much of it. It's really surreal.
Yeah, well, there's
like a world of people out there who want to watch how other people died.
Well, and okay, I was in a library yesterday, just looking at the sheer number of books, and then it's hard to imagine that same volume of media with visual content. And I think the best way is when you're scrolling through Netflix and it's just so overwhelming when you're trying to find something because there's just so many things. That's just a sliver of it.
Yeah.
Like the stuff you're talking about, there's so much of it. It's a fucking proverbial ocean of murder porn or documentaries about the worst possible aspects of humanity. And if you go down that rabbit hole, you can never come out. And that's what seems to happen with a lot of people, I think, is that whatever rabbit hole it is, whether it's fucking streaming episodes of Battlestar Galactica or fucking those MSNBC Scared Straight, or those the things where it covers the 48-hour murder.
At least with most science fiction, the shows get canceled after enough seasons that you don't get too wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
And even Stargate demonstrated with 10 seasons, you don't actually get that wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
The ones that people, and the science fiction people do get really wrapped up in are the ones that get canceled after one season, like Firefly.
Or even Star Trek. It was only, what, 3 seasons?
7.
The original?
Oh, kind of 3 seasons. I think it was technically.
It was supposed to originally go 5.
No, I think it did actually air five seasons, but because in the way that it's all put together, it's really only 3.
Right. Yeah.
Because the third season ended prematurely, then season 4 did.
But I'm saying, how long have these fucking Trekkies been obsessed with this thing that aired for
3 seasons?
3 seasons. This is fucking 60 years later, man.
Yeah.
And they're still hardcore Trekkies.
And they're making movies and TV shows.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the franchise went on, but the actual original series, that was so long ago, and it was not that much. But to see people dedicating their lives to just this short sliver of media, and they're so hardcore about it, I think
I meet people who don't realize that the first episode of Star Trek was a Captain Pike story.
Mm-hmm.
They really like Discovery, or they really like Next Generation, or Deep Space Nine, or Voyager, or Enterprise, or whatever. And that actually is really kind of interesting to me. It's kind of cool because that means there's this whole spectrum of Star Trek that's like yet to be discovered. Because what Discovery really does well is it sets the stage for that first episode of Star Trek, the Captain Pike Talos 5 story. And then in Discovery they hint at it more, and they give you a little bit more information about it. I really hope that they give us a Captain Pike #1 Spock spinoff, something that would lead up into an actual Kirk timeline that makes sense, not the Kelvin timeline, because that's so off course that it can only go where no man has gone before. It can't retread at all. It can't attempt to explain the Federation in any way that we're going to be familiar with, because they've already given it technology that's not available. Like, they've already envisioned a version of the future that's like way more advanced than even Picard's Enterprise, I feel like.
Well, at this point, I feel like there's a multiverse in the Star Trek universe.
Well, there's the Kelvin timeline. There's at least 2 Kirk timelines that can emerge. There's the one that we know, and there's the one that will emerge from the Discovery Pike timeline that we've got.
I forget if the Nexus connects them all, though.
The Nexus connects everything.
Yeah.
So at some point, they all happen at the same time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The Nexus connects them all.
That's just from generations. So.
Yeah.
And Kirk survives all the way up till that point. So we know. No, he dies on the Enterprise B, or he gets swept into the Nexus on the Enterprise B in a warp test accident or whatever.
That was a good way.
Where they save Guinan.
Yeah, I think that was a good way to sort of give elasticity to the universe, because you can always include the Nexus.
That's when they reveal that it's actually. That's when they come out and say that it's a time travel story.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they, even in the original series, they did time travel.
They do time warp in the original series.
Yeah.
They do time warp in the movies.
Yeah.
They do time warp in TNG. They do time warp all the time. But they don't. They always try to retain a continuity of the timeline. They're always really careful to try and do that kind of thing, or make a point to talk about it.
Well, but even then,
whereas with the Nexus, like once Picard realizes that it's a gateway to all of these different places and times, that he can go back to that place where Soren, or is it Soren? Yeah, Soren like launches the missile. That he can go back there. He just needs help from Kirk. And Kirk's like, yeah, why not? One last mission. Because that's the guy Kirk is. I think that's when it's very clearly a time travel story.
Yeah. But I think part of it was
minus the ships, minus the fact that they're bending space and time to travel vast distances in no time at all.
Yeah.
Just getting around that. Like, this was a phenomena of the universe happening, the ripple of the Nexus. That thing's cool.
Yeah.
Kirk didn't have to die for that to happen, though. That part was bullshit.
Yeah.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.